I've discovered that I'm quite power mad. Hello, folks. Welcome to this episode of the Superhero FX Podcast. I'm Matthew. I'm one of your co-hosts.
I'm Jacob. I'm another of your hosts.
Recently, we've been doing a lot of movie and TV show reviews, and today we're going back into some of our favorite kind of episodes where we take a general theme and look at it across a bunch of properties. And today we're talking about something that I have always been really interested in, and that, Jacob, I'm glad you were, you kind of have some similar thoughts on, which is, and we kind of were talking about how to get a handle on this topic, and I think that the title we've came up with is When It's Not the Bad Guy's Fault. And what we're talking about here is not necessarily the big bad villain, though we're going to get to that a bit, but more what happens ethically, what should be happening, what kind of decisions do we want heroes to make when our hero is facing people who are trying to stop the hero from what they're doing, but it's not necessarily their fault they're doing so. And by that we mean everything from a situation where the people are acting of their own volition, but, you know, they're cops or they're army people or something, and they genuinely believe that our hero is in the wrong and that it needs to be stopped, all the way to when people are completely mind-controlled and are, you know, a threat to our hero, but it's by no conscious choice of the people, and, you know, they certainly would rather not be doing that. Because I've always felt like it's interesting when some shows and movies make a conscious point to show the hero saying, like, oh, well, okay, it's not this person's fault they're in my way. I need to try not to hurt them. And others where it's just like, nope, they're the bad guy, we're going to kill them all. So there's a lot of great stuff to get into that I think we're going to look at. Jacob, what's your kind of general thoughts on this idea, and kind of what was your thinking when I first proposed this?
Well, when you first proposed this, it's a topic that we've sort of touched on, but in a different lens.
Hmm?
It was something like, so when we're talking about the disposable humans or disposable people episode, the who can we kill, that whole idea, right? Um, it's sort of kind of related to that, but we've never really. I was really excited because we've never really dived in to just focusing on effectively like villains, quote unquote, that not only have a point but that are like can be said to be justified in their actions and how our heroes
Yeah,
interact with them.
the Magnetos and the Killmongers of the world.
Right, but also just like, and again, like we're not I'm not going to sit here and say that I think that everything done by our modern day police force is necessarily good. But if we're looking at media, police are often portrayed a little more a little more fictionally, right? A little more dramatized. And if they're meant to be corrupt, then they're obviously corrupt. Otherwise, they're we're given to presume that they are there in serving the public, right? And
Right.
so if you've got like a public servant, but what they're doing is going directly against what our hero is doing, right? They're not even a villain in that case, but they're an antagonist. They're running counter to our hero's agenda.
Yeah, like Batman I always thought was an interesting example of that, because in Batman, um, especially Batman the Animated Series, but also in a lot of the other TV shows or movies, there's a general conception that there are a lot of corrupt cops, and the corrupt cops are, you know, people who are just as villainous as, you know, any villain's henchmen. But then also you often have some good cops in the police department who don't quite get yet that Batman is on the side of the angels, even though it doesn't seem like that. And often in Batman stories, you know, Jim Gordon's probably the best example. You know, often they come around to seeing Batman's side, but there definitely are situations where Batman is having to fight those cops, and like, I think it's interesting to look at like the perspective he takes versus a character like the Punisher, for whom, you know, once again, from the position of the police force in New York City or wherever he's operating, you basically have a vigilante killer. This is not a great thing. But the way that, you know, where the Punisher, Frank Castle, just sees these guys as, nope, they're in my way, they're the enemy, they got to die, is very different from a Batman. So yeah, I think that's a good starting point. And like you, I want to add, because I think it's a very important part to make. As part of this, one of the things we're going to be discussing a lot is the ethics of all the different people that our hero might be fighting, and a lot of those will be, you know, authority figures, police, military, you know, etc. And it's we're talking about like what is a situation when the police aren't necessarily by definition evil, and I think there's a lot of folks who might say, well, in our own world, that's not necessarily the case. That I think there's strong arguments to be made about the moral corruption of a lot of our police force in the country, and we can get into arguments about how deep that goes. But I want to make clear that what we're discussing is the ethics of when, and actually we're going to talk about a couple different cases, some of which are when the police are corrupt and some of which are when they're not. So, and in some ways that last part might be one of the most fictional things we talk about, because maybe that's not even a possibility. Or maybe it is. But I kind of want to make sure that, to be clear, that when we talk about how a hero deals with legal authorities that are trying to stop them from being a vigilante, we're keeping that fairly separate from police in our own world.
Right. We're talking about situations where those people are acting as the public servants, upholding the public good, serving and protecting as they should, right? And for anybody who does that in the real world, wonderful. Love you, applaud you, love the work that you do, thank you for your service. We all, I think, we would be very disingenuous of us to look at the world as it exists now and say that this mostly fictional idea of what the police are matches up with what we have, right?
Right.
And so when we're talking about our heroes coming up against law enforcement or coming up against public servants, we're not talking about, we're talking about them in the context of the fiction, right? And often in the fiction, it's a lot more broad stroke, right? It's a lot more generalistic and it's a lot more idealized, because people, that's an easier story to tell. It's more grokkable. It's more evocative. You only have so much room for nuance, especially in a superhero story.
And it's one reason why I think some of the stories I love most are where they do try to have some of that nuance, like the Dark. No, I think it's it is The Dark Knight, the second of the Christopher Nolan Batman movies. You know, the cops are absolutely portrayed as corrupt, but we get one cop who is corrupt because they just want money and power, and another cop in Montoya who is corrupt because the Joker, I think it's that her mother is incredibly sick and the Joker is threatening her or something. There's definitely a lot of duress happening in that decision. So, and the other thing I think I'll add is just to say we're talking a lot about that because I think it's an important thing to start with, but we are definitely going to be looking at, it's not just looking at police issues, we're going to be looking at all sorts of situations where it is not necessarily the fault of the people who are in our hero's way.
Right. Mind control is a theme that's shown up in the last few years, actually. It ebbs and flows whether or not it's in the fiction, so that's one. You could even go as far as to say another situation we could talk about is situations where someone's had, I'm not saying this excuses behavior, but someone's had, considerable trauma that has led them to make these decisions, or are, they're themselves trying to do something that from their perspective is quite heroic, trying to save a family member, trying to, we see this often in heroic stories where they're doing whatever it takes to save the one that they love, right? And you can paint that person as a hero, but if that person is the antagonist to our hero, now suddenly they're a villain, and how do we feel about our hero killing them?
I mean, it's funny. I'm going to Batman so often, but one thing I've always loved about the Batman universe is how many of the villains start with some kind of very sympathetic story like that. I think of like Mr. Freeze, for example, and that some of the iterations, like the thing he's trying to do more than anything else is save his wife. And the plot device to explain that is often ludicrously silly. But I definitely think Batman is one who takes that into account and definitely kind of thinks about, what are the intentions. So let's get into what are some of the, I want to start by just talking about what are kind of some of the different levels we're going to talk about. And then we're going to talk about just kind of the ethics of violence itself for a few minutes, because that's a nice short topic before getting into specific examples. Let's talk about like what we see as some of the different different kinds of ways in which it cannot be their fault, and what kind of decisions we do or don't want to see from heroes in each. And so let's start with the one that we were kind of talking about at the beginning. When it's people who are chasing a vigilante, someone like Batman or the Punisher or something like that, where it is cops, it's military, maybe it's civilians who, think what they see is a person acting outside of the law to maybe they think to do right, but clearly breaking the law. What's your kind of take on, like, how do you feel when you see, our hero vigilante doing violence against folks like that?
Uh, it usually is at least somewhat uncomfortable. I mean, as you know, I'm not a big fan of violence in the general. I accept it in my fiction. Um, but specifically in situations where the people who are obstructing our hero's goals don't really have, like, they're not culpable in the bad thing that's happening. Um,
Mm-hmm.
it I really really want my hero to find a for lack of a better way of putting it, a diplomatic solution in those situations, some way to talk through it or convince them, but there's not always time.
Yeah.
But generally speaking, like I would rather they run away
Yeah.
than hurt somebody that doesn't, like, that's not doing anything wrong.
Yeah, I think that's definitely true, and I think that those are like I've mentioned it before, but the Punisher is one that I think often makes me very uncomfortable for many reasons. We did a whole episode on it,
Hmm.
two actually, one about each season. But I think that's one of them. Is that Frank Castle is someone who feels justified in his own mind, and um and we're supposed to, as the viewers, agree with him, and sometimes you do, and sometimes we don't. And one thing I think that I find really interesting, especially in The Punisher, is there's such a big difference in how he treats the named cops versus the kind of mindless guys in blue. In that once we meet Madani and some of the other characters, there's a sense of, okay, this person doesn't, at first at least, doesn't agree with what Frank's doing and wants to stop him, but Frank at least seems to respect that person and doesn't want to do them harm. Whereas when it's, just 10 boys in blue coming to arrest him, I don't think he ever flat out kills any cops, but certainly the level of violence is pretty damn high. And I think that seems like that's a fairly common thing. I'm trying to think. I believe, I wish I'd looked up more of these, but I remember, I think, Daredevil also having some similar situations where cops are trying to arrest him because, again, he's, breaking the law to do what he thinks is right. And he's in the Daredevil non-lethal way, he doesn't try to kill them, just hits them in the head with an iron pipe.
Right. But the conceit is that he's not killing anybody because Daredevil doesn't kill anybody or something.
Right.
Um, yeah, we buy into it, I guess, because that's the story. With Frank Castle specifically, with the Punisher, the story that they're telling there is actually more. I feel like it's trying much harder to be, like, extra grim and extra gritty, and so there at least it matches the tone, but then it does mean that Frank's, like, his baseline level of violence is much more extreme than I'm comfortable with in general, and that means, like, when he's restraining himself, he's still way above my line for what I think you should be doing to those people who are, again, just trying to, well, again, in the fiction, just trying to do their jobs. And
Right.
in this case, like, you and I have talked about this, Frank is a vigilante, and I'm pretty sure he should be stopped. Like,
Yeah.
it's not.
Well, and I also feel like with something I hadn't thought of before, but actually I think this. I'm wondering if you agree with me. This is a relevant point. I think part of what also gets me particularly about Frank is that what he's out for is revenge. There
Mhm.
isn't a situation of, if Frank doesn't act, huge numbers of people are in danger. And I bring this up because, and again, I'm blanking on examples for this specific one, but I feel like I've seen 100 movies where the security guard who is guarding the big secret factory has no idea about the terrible thing that's happening in the factory. But unless our hero can get into the factory, 100,000 people are going to die for whatever the MacGuffin of the movie is. In a situation like that, I feel bad for the security guard, but I at least can understand, like, if the hero has no other way to get in, then some violence against that security guard, against the huge number of lives that are going to be lost, maybe that can be justified, or at least more understandable. But with someone like Frank, there is no sort of higher motive or higher justification. It's just purely it's this revenge idea that he has, and there's a justice element of killing the people who did horrible things. but that lack of an imminent danger makes me a lot. It makes it a lot harder for me to justify.
And with the security, I think the security guard point especially is very interesting, because uh it brings up the janitors on the Death Star argument, right?
From Clerks,
Where
yeah.
it's very close. I actually think they're basically the same situation where some number of ostensibly innocents, people who are not directly involved in this mass slaughter that this thing is doing, or this, in the case of the supervillain hideout, whatever's going on there, um, they're kind of in the way, right? They're
Yeah.
caught in the crossfire. Um, and when our heroes have to do violence onto them, actually, in those situations, like a little bit better when they at least takes the stories take some time to show us those people as people, as opposed
Mm,
to nope, everybody who's on this big space orb is evil, and so when it blows up, you could just cheer.
yeah. Well, and that's and I we're gonna get to that I think in a later category because I'm gonna respond with the Clerk's response of that is there an argument of those people having willingly joined with the Empire, which they should be able to recognize as morally pretty awful. But let's hold off on that because we're going to get to a couple of different categories first. The next one is when a person's been framed. And I'm thinking here the best example I think is in the movie Captain America: Civil War, where the German police, fully believe that the Bucky Barnes and Winter Soldier, and both the German police and Tony Stark, fully believe that Bucky has done terrible things. And as we
Hmm.
learn, actually, no, that forget Tony Stark because what Tony Stark thinks did happen, but what the German police think didn't happen. Um, and there again, Captain America, it for me was one of the harder moments to watch because, um, Captain America is someone who normally tries pretty hard not to do violence against people who don't deserve it, and in rescuing Bucky, the German police were going after Bucky for what seemed pretty legitimate reasons in the moment, are just to get the absolute crap beaten out of them. And I don't recall exact details of that fight, but I seem to remember like some police officers being thrown off of pretty high staircases and things that are maybe not going to just be a bruise or two.
Yeah,
What's your kind of take on situations like that where it is someone who's our hero or our hero's friend has been framed and it's not but the authorities can't necessarily know to understand that.
so there's there's an argument, I think, that in the service of ensuring justice is served, right? So in the interest of trying to make sure that someone is not punished unduly, or that the truth comes to light, etc. There are situations where our heroes are going to be interacting with people who, again, are following the law. They're trying to apprehend somebody, but the hero knows that as soon as that happens, everything is done, and that that outcome is not correct.
Right.
That's actually slightly easier for me to stomach because in that case, it's I guess more defensive.
Mm-hmm.
It's reactionary. It's a like all they have to do is stop, uh, and like regroup, and they don't have to get hit by Captain America and his good shield a million times.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, but it's still it's uncomfortable. But I think what's interesting here is that I feel like the actions of all of the individuals involved are justified, and so it just creates this situation where people are doing violence against each other and nobody is in the wrong. Because
Right.
for me, I don't think Captain America is wrong uh to want to defend Bucky, and I don't think that the German police are wrong to try to apprehend Bucky. Um, and because rather than unlike the scenario of like the security guard, like the people in the way, um, or the people trying to apprehend the hero themselves, when there's somebody else involved and the hero is trying to protect them, that to me feels different because now it's
Mm.
not about I need to make, it's not about this sort of egoistic thing of I need to make sure that I still have my agency because I'm the only one who can solve this problem. It's the problem is that you're trying to take this person away, and so you are directly against what I'm standing for right now.
Yeah. I think that's an important distinction because, like, I think at some point we should maybe just do an episode fully on the ethics of, like, the choice to become a vigilante, because I think it's directly related to so many of the questions we talk about. But I've always sort of felt that, like, if you choose to become a vigilante, one of the choices you're making is that the cops might, depending on how corrupt they are in your city, which, again, not forgetting the fact that in many cases they might be very much the enemy, but that when they're not necessarily, you're making the choice to run afoul of the law. And I think one of the ethical questions you have to resolve is, what am I going to do if the cops try to apprehend me? And I think, but I think you're right that's a choice that someone's making and the consequences of it. Captain America's decision making has nothing to do with Bucky Barnes being framed and his desire to stop that from happening. So I think you're right. That's an important distinction. And I think you're right. This is overall more justifiable. I kind of wish, like, in that scene, and there's a number of other examples of this that are treated in different ways. And I think in the ones where it seems like they're fighting more, I do wish that, maybe Cap and Bucky had tried to find a way, as you said, to escape, to like bust through a door or get out a window or, in some way. And the thing is, I guess sometimes, you want the fight scene because it makes better television or makes for a better movie. At least as some people believe. I kind of love the movie of it not being. But, and so I get from dramatic reasons why that has to happen. But so I think you're right. I don't think Cap is in the wrong for that. But I wish they had been able to find a way without, trashing that many people who are, as you said, from their perspective, trying to do the right thing. Let's kind of use that, and again, sticking on the Captain America example for a moment, although we can go to some others, is what happens when the authority. It's not that the our hero is trying to stop some totally other person and the cops are getting in the way or the soldiers are getting in the way, but when our hero recognizes that all of those authority figures are working for a government or an entity that is far more corrupt than they know. And the Captain America example is, the SHIELD agents who are fighting Cap because they don't yet realize that SHIELD is actually controlled by Hydra. What's your kind of take on those kind of situations? And besides just Cap, there's one other example that you actually helped me remember by bringing up Babylon 5, which is that in Babylon 5, for anyone who hasn't seen it, small spoilers for a show 20 years old by now, there's a point at which our heroes have broken away from the government of Earth and are placed in situations where they're fighting against the military forces of Earth, who don't realize how corrupt their own government is and think that they are fighting a legitimate traitor. And in those instances, the captain tries pretty hard not to fight them, but does and fights with lethal force when he has to. So what's kind of your take on situations like those?
So what I want to jump in for here is that the way Captain America handles that situation during Winter Soldier, right? That was that movie where we saw
Yep.
the fact that, oh, by the way, Shield's Hydra. Um, that fell too much, in my opinion, into this is a hero action movie, so this is how we have to present this trope
Mm-hmm.
area. I really want our heroes to use our words, which is why I'm glad you brought up the Babylon 5 example, because I actually feel like that story does a much better job of showing us our heroes doing everything they can to get the message out that, hey, who you're working for, you're being fed all this propaganda, you're being fed misinformation, and they actually win some people over, right? It's not that every ship they come across they end up fighting to the death, right?
Mm-hmm.
There are some people that they actually manage to, yeah, okay, we'll strike up a dialogue, we'll talk, and then, oh, really? And then, oh, this information, you didn't falsify these records. Okay, yeah, I guess you're right. That sucks. And then they join up with Sheridan and the, I guess you could call them rebels, but, they join up with the Babylon 5 forces. And I just, like, for me, if our heroes don't make at least a token effort to be all like, you're on the wrong side of this, and try to reason with these people. Um, it, I don't think it's ethically sound to
Yeah.
just go, well, I'm just going to punch you because you're on the wrong side of this.
Yeah, I think that's a really good idea, especially because, in a lot of cases, our hero doesn't start knowing things, and we get to watch the hero coming to understand, this terrible truth and having their moment of realization of, I can't work for these people anymore. And I think I'm a little disappointed sometimes when you're right. When I love it when the focus of the hero is trying to let others have that same moment and only fighting those who are really refusing. And it's a lot harder to swallow when it's the hero never even does that. It's just like, nope, you're on the side of the government still, so I can't, you're just as worthy of lethal force.
Yeah,
and I think
again,
go ahead.
It's a simpler story, right? Because they can paint with these broad strokes of with the hero or against the hero, but that kind of mentality and that kind of story is like, even for quote stories for kids or stories for younger people, no, we can put more nuance in that. We can show situations where our heroes don't see the world in black and white like that, and yeah.
Yeah.
I feel very strongly about this particular example because if they're, perfectly rational human beings who are capable of understanding right and wrong, I don't understand why our heroes don't try to communicate with them first.
Yeah. And that gets into also the questions of how much, and this is something you and I have talked about a lot on this show, it's kind of one of the whole premises of this podcast, is where is it that the writers are deciding to have the character make an ethical decision versus the writers are deciding what's going to look good on the screen. Because, the fact is here's the thing. I was going to say a hero who never uses violence to talk their way out of a problem, who never uses violence, they always try to, reason with a person. I was going to say that wouldn't work on television, except that's Star Trek for the most part. So much of the many Star Trek television shows are based on, there's some combat, but there's an awful lot of times when Kirk or Picard or any of them are able to use their words to get out of a situation. So it's certainly possible, but I think that's very much the exception. And it's unfortunate because you're right, because it means that we don't get to see the hero wrestling with that ethical question.
Right, because they sort of don't bring it up, and if they don't bring it up, then you're not always thinking about it, I think. And then that's not unreasonable, but like if you looking back retrospectively at a lot of these movies, a lot of these shows, I saw some Arrow, and now I'm like, yep, no, cannot get behind this Oliver Queen and his fun arrows. Why doesn't he have the boxing glove arrow? What happened to that?
You didn't like Star City 90210?
Well, look, there's some interesting things happening on the CWDC universe shows, but anytime they try to be very dramatic and grimdark, I'm just rolling my eyes. No,
yeah,
I
do like quite a lot of them, and I've heard some good things more recently, and I'm gonna try and watch some of them again. But it's very much more sort of guilty pleasure television instead of things like that.
And then I pick on Oliver Queen because he's straight. I mean, and yes, the way I understand the character changes, but he starts out straight up murdering people, and it's
yeah. And at least that I think in many ways actually, I'm going to push back a bit because I think the show Arrow is actually very ethically interesting because, forgive small spoilers, but he does, there is quite a lot of moral repercussions to his actions and him reconsidering and realizing how wrong he was. But maybe we'll get into more of that in the when we go straight into Vigilantes.
I'm not saying it's not ethically interesting.
Yeah.
Be careful. I'm not saying it's not ethically interesting. I'm saying that I don't agree with his actions.
Yeah. No, I get that, but I'm saying I think that's actually what makes the first seasons of it actually very good television. But let me throw now the corollary to this, which is we're actually coming back to the Star Wars situation, which is where the government is corrupt and probably the authorities should be able to know that, you know. And I what I'm saying here is like, where is the line of, you know, you chose to be part of this institution, and so it's a lot harder for me to say you're just doing your job. And the I think actually, you know, janitors working for the Empire is one possible example of this. But the one that for me really comes up is in V for Vendetta. You know, our hero does an awful lot of violence against cops who are ostensibly chasing a vigilante and doing their job. But they're also all cops who might not realize all of the corruption and the fact that the villains actually, you know, created this terrible tragedy that led to this fascist government. But they're still cops in a fascist government. And a government that I think can be pretty clearly seen to be, you know, very anti-democratic and very repressive and things like that. Where does that fall for you in terms of the ethics of violence against folks like that?
Well, the problem here is that I don't think I've ever seen a story that treats those situations with the level of nuance I feel you need to in order to really make that evaluation. Because every individual you come across, right, in those situations could be there of their own volition and with the knowledge and saying, yeah, but, you know, they pay really well, or, you know, it's a living. Or it could be a situation where they're like, look, I don't have any other options. It was this or starve, or it was this or, you know, my family was going to starve, and in the case of the First Order troops, they're brainwashed, right? Like,
yeah,
like that's
actually,
not on them.
First Order soldiers was one I hadn't thought of, but that what we learned about Finn and the other First Order soldiers, that's actually a great example.
Yeah, yeah, and it's like it's not mind control; it's different, right? But these are people who have been indoctrinated, right, with these ideas, and like, can you fault them for being mentally manipulated like that? I don't know. Like that's a tough one.
It's an interesting one, and I feel like the brainwash, the literally like raised from birth, you know, as a real world example, we hear less about this now, and I don't know if it's because it's less of a problem or because it's just getting less media attention, but, you know, 5-10 years ago, we were hearing quite a lot about these armies of child soldiers in parts of Africa, where these were, you know, committing horrific atrocities. But often it was like, you know, boys between the ages of 13 and 18 who had been raised by these armies from the time they were 2 or 3. And so, yeah, there again, it raises all sorts of questions. And I feel like, I guess the way I would see it is, you know, like to start with my first example, if you're working for the government in V for Vendetta, maybe you're doing it for reasons that are not fully of your own control. And I feel like maybe there's a sense of, I'm not ready to hate those people. Like, I'm not ready to cheer. I don't necessarily want to cheer when those people are hurt because of, like, you know, in the same way I might be like, you know, if our hero goes into a Nazi convention or a KKK meeting. But it's never that I want to justify violence, but I guess I feel like there's less of a need for our hero to go out of their way to not have to use violence than it would be against a situation like in terms of that moral scale of how much is it their fault. Those situations, I think you're right. Sometimes it's the culpability is less, but I guess I'm less concerned about it in those situations.
I feel like there's a like 1 to 10 punch a Nazi scale.
Yeah.
Where 10 is they're a true believer punching, right? Punching happens. They bought in, or they are one of the controlling influences, and like the people who are unwitting but are still involved, you know, they're on the 2 or 3, and that's more of a if you must kind of situation where I don't like it, but there are times where it probably has to happen. It just sucks to blow up a space station of them, right? If they were just there to clean the toilets.
Yeah. Yeah, no, and it's and I think that's the hard choice, and you know, and it's funny, like you know, Kevin Smith I think is an ethicist in his own way, and that because the point that's made in response in that first Clerks movie is that, you know, to some extent you are making a choice, even if it's just to you know, to fix a roof or to clean the toilets, and the rejoinder then is, as you said, what if there isn't a choice? Whether it's, you know, economic necessity or you've actually been drafted or things like that. And I guess part of where it comes down to me is, especially in terms of media, I feel like there's two levels of the ways that violence is portrayed. One of which is when we just see the hero doing violence, and the question is, like, is the hero justified in using his violence? And the other is, how do we feel about the movie celebrating that violence? You know, one of my first episodes with Paul was about the movie Desperado, and how in that movie, like, it's pretty clear that we are supposed to cheer and root for the awesome violence because the violence is done in a very artistic, hilarious, ridiculous, over-the-top way that makes you go like, oh my God, look at that great way he killed that guy. And I guess, yeah, that's the kind of like the random soldier in the army or the military of a fascist government. There, I think I need to have met an actual person and know that they're an actual, like, fucked up person if I'm going to want to root for them to die in some cool way. Even that sentence sounds morally horrible, but you know what I mean in terms
Right.
of watching TV.
Right.
I'm not rooting for anyone's death, but like that, you know, but I think when it's just, you know, 5 random guys in the, who are, you know, the bottom of the totem pole of an evil army, unless I know that, like, everyone has to go through the secret initiation and prove that they're loyal. Yeah, I think I don't have a moral problem with a hero doing violence towards them, and I don't think the hero has to pull their punches, but I don't want the movie to celebrate it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it's okay to have the action sequence. It's okay to have the victory or the we blew up the Death Star, but let's acknowledge the fact that war sucks and people die that probably didn't need to. And if we have that, I'm a lot happier with it because then we're not romanticizing things that are actually that should upset us, right? I guess
Right.
that's why I want, but don't think I'm going to get ever, the level of nuance of our hero knowing or learning, the difference between the person in the hallway of the evil lair that is, not really aware of what's going on versus somebody who's all like, yeah, screw those guys. I'm really flying high. This is great. Love this.
Right.
Right?
Well,
Really happy
and,
to get the one punched to death and the other one not so much.
and I think it raises an interesting question that actually is a pretty big part of, like, historical debates and things like that, which is, where is the line between, when a society does evil things, like, where is the line between saying it was just the fault of the leaders versus it was the fault of the society itself versus it was the fault of every single individual in that society? And I'm going to take the historic discussion about Nazi Germany here for a second, because I've studied actually quite a lot about World War II, and I'm really interested in the way the Nazis continue to be talked about in historical circles. And you've really kind of seen 3 different schools of thought happen over the last 30 or 40 years with some evolution. And the first being a sense of, like, the German people, it wasn't necessarily their fault, and it was, Hitler and the Nazis, and most of Germans were just as much victims of the Nazis as everybody else. And I think more recently there's been a lot of real pushback on that idea and, like, understanding of, like, for the Nazis to be able to thrive, you had to have, a basic fundamental understanding in the society itself of tolerating this kind of evil and going along with this kind of evil. And on the third, like, but does that mean that, like, every single 18-year-old German boy who got drafted into the German army is just as evil as the SS officer at Auschwitz? And I think that's kind of what we're talking about here is, like, what is the moral culpability of the empire as a whole, or the police of a fascist nation as a whole, versus, like, the moral culpability of each individual person in that situation, many of whom might not want to be in that situation, or many of whom like, I don't know, I'm kind of wandering a bit here, but I'm always interested when I hear discussions about this, because while I'm very much on the side of you don't just blame the leaders, when the whole society is rotten, you have to talk about that. It goes too far when I see things like, every Confederate soldier deserved to die, which is something I saw posted recently, or that, every German soldier was by definition evil. Because I don't know where does that. I don't necessarily think those statements are wrong, but I don't know where we draw those lines of recognizing the evil that is inherent in a society versus saying that every single individual, therefore, is as equally morally culpable.
I think that historically, the only way to assess that, right, is um if you're assessing it historically, you can only look at societies as a whole and at individuals who achieved a significant level of prominence, right?
Mm-hmm.
We've lost the detail on a lot of the people who are now deceased, right? So
Right.
we'll never know. Um, we could uh, we could look at things going on in our own world today and ask about moral culpability and who's responsible for what and to what degree each, for example, let's say senators in a given body. No,
Just as a
I'm like
purely
you laugh.
hypothetical.
You're laughing. I'm being dead serious. Uh,
Mm.
how many of them? How many people in the Senate are directly responsible for the outcome of this trial, versus how many are, you know, obviously that they're still taking an action, but are doing it for, I guess what you could say is different reasons. How many are doing it to maintain power or to try to maintain power, and it comes down to the reasons why these individuals do things, and that's almost guaranteed going to get lost historically. We're not going to know for even a body of 40 people, right? We're talking about
I
an army of thousands.
I guess to me, I think the Senate example is a good one for the larger discussion, but I think I disagree with you pretty strongly there because I think for me, if you are part of something that is fundamentally evil, and yes, I am calling the Republican Senate at this point tolerating corruption in the way it is fundamentally evil. Um, I do think that in order for me to justify you being a part of it, I need to believe that you have a fundamental lack of autonomy. That you were brainwashed as a child, or that you were in an economic situation where the military was literally the only, alternative to starvation. And to me, like, I fully agree with you. I think that there are some people who are true Trump believers, and there are others who are just terrified of the Democrats for whatever reason, and there are others who are just they really don't want to lose re-election. To me, none of those are to me, if you are in a position of power like the Senate, you have committed to take those kind of risks in order to do the right thing. And I can morally understand, a person joining a corrupt police force or army out of desperation. I don't love the choice, but I can not necessarily label it as awful. I think once you get to the level of Senate, like, the reasons are interesting, but they don't. To me, there is absolutely no moral difference between Mitch McConnell and Senator Murkowski. Whether it's you're the true Trump believer or you just want to get reelected. If you're supporting the overthrow of democracy without that much actual personal risk to yourself, I see those as morally equivalent.
Interesting. I guess morally, perhaps, I think that the reasoning behind the decision has a different ethical weight,
Mm-hmm.
and so therefore I would be differently comfortable with heroes, for example, choosing to terminate one versus another, right?
Mm.
If they were like, we've got to clean this up, if one person's like, look, I was just like, if I don't do this, they're just going to put somebody else in office that will, and at least here I have the opportunity to do something. I can pick my battles, right? Versus someone who's again like a true believer.
Right.
And I think that there's a distinction that could be made there. I am not saying anybody in the Senate who's a Republican is of the former position. I'm just allowing for the possibility, right? I guess what I'm saying is that like the morality of the decision is based on the outcome, right? Is
Yeah.
like they know full well what the decision is and what the outcome's going to be. I don't disagree with you that the has the same moral weight across all of them.
It's interesting when you put it that way, because I think I actually say, like, and maybe we can move. I have a different example, I think, of the thing you're getting at that is more in our sci-fi realm. But just to
Sure.
finish on the Senate example, in some ways, again, if we assume that what's happening in the Senate is happening in a fictional world, to me, the person who is a true believer in an evil government, I almost find more morally supportable than the person who says, "Yeah, but I could lose my." Like, to me, Mitch McConnell is an awful, awful human being, but I think of Lisa Markowski as morally worse. Because to me, that's not even truly believing in the Trump agenda. It's just absolute cowardness in the face of, like, you have the power to stop evil, and you just don't want to lose an election. Like, to me, that's morally worse than having a true belief and the true belief being terrible.
Hmm.
Um,
Interesting.
I
I
uh,
disagree. But
well,
okay.
actually, let's go a little deeper on that. So where would you see that? And then I want to shift to the other example I was going to
Well,
bring up.
again, I guess from my perspective, uh, from my perspective, the morality in of the action of the choice that gets made ultimately, I see as equivalent because the outcome is equivalent, right? When you get to their justifications, to me, that's a difference in ethics, and then I have to
Mm,
know what their personal motivations are in the entirety, right? Which is
right.
why going back to the fictional examples again, we don't see this in the mooks because the mooks are often barely treated as people. Um, but when we do get characterization of them, that's when we get the more interesting stories, right? And
Yeah.
then it's interesting because when we get characterization, then suddenly our heroes do talk to them, right?
Yeah.
So it's almost like those people have moral value and the other people don't.
I think that's a
Hmm.
good point. I think, this decision of, like, what do you do when you're a person who has real power in the face of evil? This is one we should definitely explore more in a later episode. But the example I'm going to turn to you is, because I think this is actually, I'm surprised I didn't think of it before, but I think this is one of the best of the when is it or is it not ethical to collaborate with evil. Galen Erso, you've seen the movie Rogue One, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, you know, the father of our hero who, decides to go back to work for the Empire and decides to help build the Death Star because, as he believes it, if he doesn't do it, someone else will. Even though we're kind of being told that that's not the case because they can't do it. They're saying without him, but he seems to believe they can. But then his idea is that he's going to work from within inside to kind of, like, as you said, to kind of, like, at least I can do more damage from within the inside.
Hmm.
Um, and in
I
that
could
movie,
introduce the concept of ventilation.
yes, exactly. And in that movie, in what I think is one of the really interesting ethical points in the movie, some folks in the Rebel Alliance who are portrayed as antagonists, not heroes, and I kind of think I understand why, decide, nope, he's a collaborator. We're not interested in what he's trying to do. He is just as morally culpable as anyone else. We need to take him out. And in the movie, it's not a perfect example because it's actually not just like a moral decision. It's like bad strategy to take him out because of what he knows. But putting that aside, like, where do you place a Galen Erso on this kind of moral scale of someone who is, you know, willingly collaborating with evil because they believe that what they're doing is kind of from within inside going to make it easier to fight the evil, but it's not clear if they're doing more harm than good.
So I have a question for you. I think I know the answer, which is unfortunate. Have you seen Angel season 5?
I have not, but I'm most likely not going to see it, and so I don't mind if you spoil me.
Okay, so unfortunately, spoiling you doesn't help because it's the same kind of situation where the title character of the show ends up deciding to take over. He's offered the ability to take over the evil law firm, and he takes it because he thinks that he can do more good by trying to mitigate the amount of damage that the
Right.
law firm does, right? That Wolfram and Hart does. Um, and so these situations where characters think that the way that they can do the most good is by tying their ship to, something that is demonstrably evil, but allows them to work from the inside. I mean, not everybody has the ability to stand, you know, if their other option is, I'm going to stand up, stare it blankly in the face, and gloriously die, that doesn't seem like they accomplished as much good as what they could do from the inside. So,
Yeah.
honestly, to me, it actually feels like the most heroic choice to acknowledge your limitations and to acknowledge what you have the capacity to do and what you can't, and then try to leverage your strengths to do as much good as you can in a bad
Mm.
situation.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, and I think I'm probably mostly there with you. I in some ways it comes down to a kind of moral calculus, and it's hard to calculate that, because
Hmm.
in Galen Erso's situation, you could argue like it really comes down to like could they have actually built the Death Star with him or without him, and when you look because on one level you sort of look at like you know the Death Star before it's destroyed, kills millions and millions of people on Alderaan and on in Jeddah and places like that. And so there's a question of like, you know, do all of those deaths just like could there have been a way to stop the Death Star plans without doing any of that? And would it have involved Galen Erso being willing to die so that he couldn't be used to help the plans? And there's an extent to which you can get it's an argument more about what that reality of the situation, and that's not what we're going for here. But um, I think I am mostly with you of if you can do more damage from the inside, then I'm for it. I guess I feel like that has to be balanced against to what extent is you simply being there helping to kind of give cover or to justify something that should be by definition unjustifiable, and taking it back to the arguments where we started in our own world. I think some of the most interesting arguments are from those people who say like, look, I joined a police force that I know isn't great because I feel like my being a good officer can try and change things, versus the folks who say like, yeah, but you being a good person makes it seem like the police aren't as fundamentally corrupt as they are, and that does more harm than good. And not to get into the specifics of that debate, but I guess I feel like I would like to see more when we do have a character whose claim is that they are doing good from the inside, even though they're inside of an evil institution. I wish I saw that pushed more, because I do think it's an easy way to justify the safer perspective. But kind of taking it back to the where we started, I guess then where does Galen Erso fall on your scale of can we do violence against them? Like if those who have the perspective of if it's more not like an attempt to target Galen Erso, but it's we want to kill Director Krennic, but he's standing next to Galen Erso. Does the fact that Galen Erso joined this institution but to try and do good, does that mean we should be more careful to try and protect him? Or does the fact that he's kind of, whatever his motives, he's signed up with the evil institution, mean that if he's caught in the crossfire, we're okay with that?
Yeah, that one is a tough nut to crack for me.
Yeah.
Um, I don't actually think I have a good answer. Uh, I don't really want to say that you shouldn't try to take the bad guys out, when given the opportunity.
Mm-hmm.
And certainly it's different. This is a slam dunk. No, don't do it. If it's a hostage, right, or an innocent. Um, it gets then this is why you're bringing the question up, right? It gets a lot more challenging when this is somebody who is actively engaged in doing the evil thing, um, but with the intent of like effectively pre-sabotaging the effort.
Yeah.
Um, and like so that person's position morally is not really completely in the dark end, but at the same time, I'm not sure it should stay your hand. I'm
Right.
not sure it shouldn't either. Like that that one's one I'm not sure I have an answer for.
Yeah. No, and I think I'm kind of in the same boat, because I feel like I remember watching the movie and feeling like in some ways, the character of Galen Erso was the most morally interesting to me, and the one that I part of why I love Rogue One so much is I feel like it takes, as much as I love the original Star Wars movies, it paints things in very, very moral black and white lines, and the Force is all about the potential corrupting influence of giving in to your hatred of evil. But it's very clear that, evil is evil unless it can be brought all the way back to good, but there's no middle ground. And I love that Rogue One really portrays that, no, there's our heroes do terrible things, and there's all sorts of middle ground there. But yeah, I think that one becomes a really interesting one. Let's shift gears a lot, and we can finally stop talking about cops, because I admit all the connections to our real world has made that entire conversation very uncomfortable. But I think it was important questions to ask. But let's start talking now about where we're talking about civilians. And we're going to start with what I think both of us agree is one of the best ways this issue is portrayed, which is the topic of mind control. And here what we're talking about is where, there are physical bodies standing in the way of our hero and perhaps lethally threatening our hero or lethally threatening other people. But the mind that controls that body has nothing to do with the decision to do these things. And the example that I mentioned that I think we both love is Jessica Jones in season 1, where the Purple Man is literally mind controlling people to make them attack Jessica, when those actual people in no way want to do it. And some other examples are when Loki is controlling Hawkeye in the movie Avengers. Anytime Superman comes into contact with red kryptonite, the character of Garibaldi in Babylon 5, who gets literally brainwashed by telepaths. And in all of those cases, we see different each of those movies or TV shows has a very different perspective on whether or not those people should be or should not be subjected to violence. What's your take on this question? Like some of these ways of approaching it.
So obviously, I prefer Jessica Jones's approach, which is that literally any of Kilgrave's victims, I'm not going to victimize them further. And I think that does come from a place of some of her own personal trauma, because she's remembering killing somebody under Kilgrave's orders, right?
Yeah.
And that has affected her to the point where she doesn't want to inflict that level of harm on anyone, and also understands that these people can be controlled to the point where they're able to do terrible harm, not of their own volition, not of their own control. And so she has it's obviously, I really appreciate a hero who's able to have that level of empathy and compassion for people who are under that kind of control, and then act in a way that I agree with, where she won't do violence onto them, or I mean, obviously, in her case, even small amounts of violence can be deadly, so she has to be very controlled about it, period. I don't remember what happened with Hawkeye, actually, because it's been way too long now since I've seen Avengers.
So, my memory is that we see Hawkeye fighting Natasha, and they're neither one of those. Well, I guess they, Hawkeye fires arrows, but Natasha isn't someone who everything I realize, we don't see her deciding not to use lethal violence in the fight, and I think my memory is that she says things that are sort of along the lines of, look, if I have to kill you, I'm going to kill you. Mm-hmm. But she is certainly trying to sort of talk him down, and is certainly very happy when, banging his head really hard undoes the Loki magic for movie reasons.
Right.
Right. But I certainly don't have a sense of it doesn't seem like she has some recognition of that this is not his fault necessarily, but I don't necessarily feel like she has a sense of therefore morally I have to kill him. It's more like, she owes him a debt, and killing him is not really the good way to pay off a moral debt.
Whenever we get situations like that, there was actually one that came up more recently on Supernatural, where a character is under the control of somebody else, and it's a character who's a romantic interest for one of the leads, and the other of the leads is being violenced upon, and he says at one point, "Don't make me do this," and I'm like, I just got this sinking feeling in my stomach. It's like, you're not going to kill her. That's ridiculous. Don't you dare. That's not
I
morally defensible at all.
I think I know what you're talking about, but remind me.
Oh, you wouldn't have seen this. This
Oh,
is
okay.
last season. This is current season, which is last season Supernatural. Characters
Oh,
being
okay.
controlled by God. Um,
As you
to
do.
like literally being, yeah, you know,
Yeah.
God's a real character in this show. It's good times. But yeah, so like that particular scene really rubbed me the wrong way. Whenever our heroes deal with a mind controlled person and bring up that, well, I might have to use lethal force here. I'm like, you can't. That's
Yeah.
not right.
Well, and it's interesting because this is again part of why I think Jessica Jones is one of the best things ever made on television. Um, what I love there is I feel, backing up a step, I don't like situations where I don't feel like the writers understand the ethical consequences of what's happening. And I
Yes.
think like Punisher is a great example of that. To me, it's the exact opposite because not only it is very clear that the writers understand the moral quandary Jessica Jones is in, and not only do the writers know it and Jessica knows it, but the villain himself knows it. And one of the things I think makes Jessica Jones this question so interesting is because I think most of the time I am completely on your side of if it's absolutely not their fault, you need to not harm them. But there's an argument of like Jessica Jones could have stopped Purple Man fairly early in that show if she had been willing to, hurt or maybe even have to kill a few of the people he's mind controlled. He winds up doing far more harm because of how long it takes before he's ever actually, dealt with by her. And in part because he knows this ethical choice she makes, and so he's very intentionally, using that against her to make it impossible for her to come after him. I think, because again, I don't think you can play a body count, balanced utilitarianism game. So I feel like I still feel like Jessica Jones, like that she's still doing the right thing. But does his using that against her and the fact that like she probably could have stopped him earlier, does that change it all for you, or do you still pretty firm on that's what you have to do?
I mean, yeah, he's playing her real strong, but like the reason why that works is because Jessica is a moral and ethical person in those situations. And I think if you want to be the hero, you can't compromise that for the convenience of the moment, right?
Right.
Now you could make the argument that taking Kilgrave down sooner will cause less harm to the world in the long run. I don't agree with that argument, but it's an argument that could be made. I
Right.
don't agree that that is a. I guess it's demonstrably a true argument, but I don't think that it is a good justification for taking the action.
Yeah. And I think that you're mostly the case there. I think like go back to the security guard argument I brought up at the beginning. If it's not a paid security guard, but it's two mind control people who are standing in the way of you and defusing the bomb that's going to blow up a whole city. I don't think the fact that they're mind like I think that is an instance where there is justification to not go out of your way to harm them, but harm them if necessary to prevent some far more evil tragedy. Um, and I'm not saying, like, again, I don't want to get into a numbers game of 100,000 people justifies it, but 10 doesn't. But I guess I feel like it's not an absolute, but that it has to be something truly horrific to start making me feel like that's the decision I want our hero to make.
Right, and even then, it's well, if you have to, but it still, it sits poorly. It's not it's suboptimal. If there was another way, I want the hero to pursue it
Yeah. And I guess what I would feel like is what I want in media is to see that the hero knows that.
and wrestles
Um
with it. Yeah,
yeah, that at least they understand like it's not that there's a difference between beating up the bad guy versus beating up the person who is supporting the bad guy through absolutely no fault of their own. Um and what I often use here as the counterexample to this is the movie Suicide Squad because um there's a lot of things I do like about that movie, although fundamentally it's pretty terrible. Um, Mostly I like the portrayal of Amanda Waller. But in that movie, we have a whole bunch of people who are being mind controlled by the big bad, and our heroes are just absolutely blowing them away. I mean, there's just no question of, these are zombies, they are not people, they have no moral weight, even though it's kind of understood that, like, these people could be people again once the big bad's defeated. But at the same time, there are elements where, when particular members of the hero fall under the influence of the big bad, like, those are people who need to be rescued because they're our friends. They're people we got to know. And to me, that's one of the worst examples of this, where there's a real moral hypocrisy on the case of in the part of the characters, but the writers don't even seem to realize that.
Well, so forgive me, I've not actually seen Suicide Squad, but am I mistaken that our heroes, quote unquote, in this movie are from Batman's rogues gallery of villains?
Well, they are, but one of the central conceits of the movie is that while these people don't, it's kind of the morals versus ethics questions, because the idea is supposed to be that these people don't follow the law, but they do have their own moral and ethical codes, and that they are, like, not that they're like vigilantes for justice, but that they are, sort of like Harley is portrayed as someone who has no problem, stealing and killing, but also has a very strong morality about, protecting her friends and protecting her family and being willing to sacrifice herself or to sacrifice things on behalf of the people she cares about. Go ahead.
That sounds to me, at least for Harley's character's case, it's very that the actions you were describing earlier are very consistent with that character.
I guess it is, but I think, again, that's the kind of thing where, I don't think the writers were really, like, it didn't feel like the writers realized that. I don't think, like, the writers were saying that Harley's making a conscious choice of, I'm not going to care about the people who are not known to me, but if I know you, then I do. In a way that I feel like if the movie had even acknowledged that, or someone had asked her about that, it would have changed things a lot.
Sure. Yeah, I get that. It certainly wouldn't be the 10th movie I've become familiar with that it's clear that these is not being asked, because if any amount of intentionality is enough for me to go, oh, okay, I see, there, you're aware of this. But if they don't put it anywhere in the script or anywhere on screen, you have to assume they just don't understand.
Yeah, no, or they don't understand, or they don't care. Either
Right.
one of which I think is a
It depends on
problem.
how it's shot too, but, like,
Yeah.
obviously if you're able to come away with that interpretation, yeah.
Well, and let's go to one more, because I think this is in some ways one of the most interesting. Because in some, like, part of what we're talking about here also is, like, the one individual police officer, the one individual grunt, the one individual brainwashed person. What about when it's Superman? What are the ethics of, using violence against a literal demigod with world-destroying powers when he's under the effects of red kryptonite and thus acting in ways completely in violation of what would normally be his morality?
Interestingly, here's where my script flips a bit.
Mm,
Uh, because of the magnitude of harm that Superman is capable of doing at a moment's notice, you don't really have the luxury, I feel, of not taking your shot if you get the opportunity. Um,
yeah.
because every moment that you try to find another way is another moment that considerable harm is happening, right? And there it's really hard to justify going, well, but if we do this, then we get Soup's back. And yeah, Soup's on the side of good is fantastic, right? He is, the quintessential hero, right? He's capable of doing a large amount of good.
Mm,
But if you don't have a guarantee that you're going to be able to get the red kryptonite off of him or whatever in the world is, or if it's a situation where Brainiac's controlling him, as it's happened in a plot line or two, if you're not able to wrest him away from those situations, as you put it, he's like a demigod. He's like, what? Leaving him be for any period of time exposes way too much risk, I feel. Uh, and so, like, there, I think you do have to come down to a numbers game.
yeah. No, I think that's true, and I think it, I feel like in our own world, I have very similar thoughts of, if you harm someone accidentally, then, I understand it. But the more power you have and the more able you are to accidentally harm someone, the more I feel like there's a moral culpability there. And in one of my favorite episodes of Justice League, which is in many ways kind of a continuation of Batman the Animated Series, because it's that Batman
Hmm.
now as part of the Justice League. Have you seen that show, Justice League?
I love Justice League.
Okay,
It
yeah,
really is Batman's story most of the time. It's just that there
yeah.
are other DC characters. Sometimes they get stories.
And some of my favorite episodes are where not even Superman does go evil, but where it's just about the precautions Batman takes in case he goes evil, and that um, there's a wonderful scene I remember of Amanda Waller and Batman, connecting because they realize they both have green kryptonite and they both keep it with them. And, everyone else is horrified about this, about like, how could you have that? And they both are like, what are you, nuts? Like, Superman he means well, but it's, like, it's like your buddy who can very easily get drunk, like you don't
Hmm.
let him drive. And when there's, the possibility that if anyone gets their hands on this red glowing rock, it's going to make the most powerful being in the known universe potentially go fundamentally evil. Yeah, I think you're right. Like it's not necessarily Superman's fault, but there's a fundamental danger that's posed that's there.
And just again, if you can, if he can be talked down, so like we're making a separation from how Kingdom Come ended. If you recall, with the
Mm,
preacher actually managing to reason with him, if he can be talked down, great, okay, he's still a force for a considerable force for good. But if that's not an option and you've got
yeah.
the opportunity to take him down, I think you have to.
Well, and if I remember Kingdom Come, it's not red kryptonite. So
Oh
Superman
no, he's
is
just
in
mad.
control. Yeah, he's just making bad decisions so he could make other decisions. Like I
Yes,
think the conceit of red kryptonite is he can't really be talked down.
right,
But I
exactly.
don't remember it too well.
No, no,
Um,
it's a mind influencing thing. Red Kryptonite makes him a jerk.
yeah. Let's shift to another interesting one. And I think it's one that I think is best explored in Star Trek, although I know I've seen it in other things. And there's a number of episodes of Star Trek of all of the series where they come across some kind of life form. Often it's a kind that they have never experienced before, and for whatever reason, this new life form regards our heroes on the Enterprise as a threat, and often it's because the people on the Enterprise are, without in any way intending to, like screwing up their homes or threatening them, or for destroying the environment of them or things like that. And so it's where uh I think I described this as when the big bad themselves doesn't realize that they are wrong. When they think that the for very understandable reasons that our heroes are the enemy. And certainly there's other situations where that can happen as well. What's your kind of take on one more like this?
Well, when we're talking about old Trek, at least, so like, and by old Trek I mean pre Star Trek Frontier, pre Star Trek 90210.
Right.
Um, like, so when we're talking about like Star Trek: The Next Generation, there's some great examples of what you're talking about here, and I think specifically for those situations, Star Trek is such a different example of how media treats these things,
mm,
because they're always, especially in Next Gen, always looking for that diplomatic solution. There's a very early episode of Next Gen, right, where um, they're on this incredibly peaceful planet, and Wesley Crusher like ends up accidentally trampling some plants. Uh,
right.
and then the law on the planet is, well, now he has to die.
Mm,
All laws are, we've attained this peaceful society because breaking any law is subject to capital punishment. And the crew of the Enterprise they have the power, because this is not a militaristic society, right? They have the power to just go, nope, we're going to take him away by force, and they choose not to.
Yeah.
multiple times choose not to and instead pursue uh, trying to talk with them, trying to reason with the society, trying to figure out if there's, is there a way around it? Is there a legal defense? Do you have trials? Is there some kind of piece of your law that we can utilize to justify treating him differently because he's an outsider? Like,
Yeah.
it's not quite the same because there, it's also different when, for example, there was an alien life form that was attaching itself to the hull of the Enterprise, right?
Mm.
Um, and it was sucking energy out of the ship, or it was attached to the shield, it was sucking energy out of the ship. Um, it was just hungry. It thought
Yeah.
that the Enterprise was its mother. And then its mother did come around and was very angry that its children were attached to this other thing, and was aggressing against the Enterprise. And there they were in real mortal peril. And they did not for a second go, let's just kill this thing and go away, like, well, Worf did, right?
Yeah.
Because that's Worf. Tactical analysis is, I would like to push the red button and kill a thing, please. But instead, they found a creative solution to get out of that situation. But Star Trek as a whole always approached those scenarios from how do we do this without using violence? How do we solve this problem without using violence? And
Right.
it's one of the reasons I love Star Trek so much, especially Next Gen and TOS, Deep Space Nine, even Voyager.
I agree with you, and the Star Wars example is very much what I had in mind, more so than because the Wesley Crusher I think is an interesting question, but that's actually more about like unjust laws or crazy laws, or I shouldn't use the word crazy, but you know what I mean. Um, Whereas I think that episode with the alien life form is much more the issue, is because here now we're talking about situations where something is a threat, but not for any moral reason. The our heroes going through a jungle and dealing with strange animal creatures that want to attack them. In the Star Wars universe, something I never really loved is that sometime around the time that they made the bantha, or not the bantha, oh god, what I'm gonna get thrown off my own Star Wars podcast, but what's the Rancor? God, I'm embarrassed about that. Right around the time Lucas figured out that the Rancor was kind of fun to make, all of a sudden our heroes in Star Wars, pretty much every movie since then, at some point deal with some huge monster creature that's just living its life trying to get some food. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and so yeah, there again, I really love that Star Trek does this, and I can't think of many others that do, where there's a real sense of like, this thing is a threat to us, but it's not bad. It's just doing what it does. And in Star Trek especially, what I like is that they're often like, it's not even that this is coming to us as a threat, it's that we are blundering across the galaxy and all of a sudden we invaded its territory. And so yeah, we don't have the right to, we disturbed it, it feels like we're a threat, it's attacking us, we should back off rather than just kill it. And I
Right.
think that's such a good way to approach that ethical question.
It is slightly different, I think, when you are encroaching upon the other entity's territory versus when it came to you. Although, I this might be a topic for a different time, but we could also talk about Galactus in the same context of
Mm,
Galactus is just hungry. Like,
yeah.
he eats planets. That's his food. Is it really correct? Is it ethically sound to fight and possibly kill Galactus when he's just trying to eat?
Well, and I feel like here, and this is again, it's I think this is an important moral distinction that I wish movies and TV show, I wish more addressed, and I really love when they address. To me, it's the difference between punching a Nazi and shooting a rabid dog. Um,
Yeah.
you know, the Nazi is not just a threat, but is like a morally terrible person, and I don't think violence is deserved against anyone, but if anyone deserves violence, it's the Nazi. And yeah, I'm going to cheer a little bit when I see someone, punch a Nazi, or even, in that situation where it's necessary, kill a Nazi. I'm not advocating people to go out and kill Nazis today. I'm just saying, like, when the Nazi's a threat, yeah, if I hear about a Nazi getting shot while they're threatening someone, yeah, I'm going to cheer. You don't cheer when a rabid dog is put down. Like, that's you know, it's not safe to have that dog loose, and maybe you can drive it off, but maybe you know, to prevent. I don't know enough about biology and the way rabies spreads, but my certain understanding is that's a situation where, you know, if it's a threat, you're not going to be able to talk it out of being a threat. You have to put it down. And I guess it'd be an interesting that'd be an interesting scale of, like, how do we judge villains from the you know, rabid dog to a Nazi scale of, you know, what, because I think it really has a lot to do with how do I want the violence portrayed? Because when our heroes are fighting a rabid dog rather than fighting a Nazi, I'm much less interested in the violence being beautiful. You know, I'm much less, because I don't want to cheer it. I will see it as necessary, but I'm not going to see it as like, yeah, go you guys, look at that cool thing you just did.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
We want to wrap up. Both of us are, speaking of Galactus, we're both pretty hungry and have dinner getting ready.
That's why I brought it up.
Exactly. Let's talk about the last one that I know is dear to your heart, and then actually we're going to be doing a whole episode on at a later point. And this is where it's actually programming. And we're talking here about digital and mechanical life forms, are various kinds of artificial intelligence, and as well as, I think we're also including under this, Borg drones. People who very clearly were people at one point, but now either people who were people and are now drones, or people who are artificial intelligence and were created to do the things they were doing. What's your moral take on this? Because I'm guessing you have a thought or two.
Number one, Borg drones are people. Number two, they are. Just because they're an individual in a collective consciousness, right? So that they're one part of that consciousness, but it's still, yeah. Anyway, in terms of the programming them, the mechanical life forms themselves, this particular question is wrestled with, not really to my satisfaction either, but I still enjoy the franchise in the Mass Effect series, where there's a group of AI aliens called the Geth that were created by another race, that, you know, attain sentience and have their own motivations now. And you do end up picking off a fair number of them, but you also end up like finding one as an ally and learning that it's a person. And that makes it a lot harder when you're dealing with some decisions later. Like, there's a decision that you have about whether or not you want to rewrite a part of their code because of something that's happening. It's like, you know, it gets really gray. And obviously for me, like, if it were a person, I wouldn't want to reprogram a person, because that seems kind of wrong, unless they had already been, like, programmed in a particular way and I was just righting a wrong, right? Getting it back to status quo. In terms of killing them, right? I see no difference between the times in the game where I had to gun down a bunch of Geth versus the times where I did gun down a bunch of Krogan or any of the other biological races. But I felt a little worse because I knew in those situations those were ones whose control had been overwritten by another entity, right? Where they were no longer masters of their own choices, right? And so in some ways that's actually worse than once you get to the later part in the game and the series where everybody you're fighting is under these situations, but it's like a reanimated corpse basically. So they're dead. And now you're fighting this dead thing. The Geth are the only ones that are still basically what they were before you started fighting them, or before any changes, and that makes it worse for me, because absent the programming change from this evil influence, that thing wouldn't have menaced me at all, right? That Geth would not have menaced me at all. They would be fine, and we would be cool, and maybe we could, like, hang out. But instead, I they shoot at me, and I don't like that.
Yeah. No, I think I don't know those games, but I think that raises some really good questions. Because you're right. It's that, and again, we're gonna at some point talk about video games and all the moral questions they raise. Let me throw a related one at you, and we'll probably do a whole episode on this because I know this is one that you and I have talked about a bit. The battle droids in the Star Wars prequels.
Mm-hmm.
They are robots that have been programmed to act in a certain way. They've been programmed by someone with a horrible sense of humor. I don't understand why they were programmed the way they did. In my Star Wars podcast, our mutual friend Riki actually made exactly that point. But in the Star Wars movies, in the prequels, and in the Clone Wars shows, the less in Clone Wars, violence against the clones is portrayed as 100% slapstick ridiculous, and we constantly see clones, going "uh-oh" right before they're killed, or
You mean the
terrible...
droids?
The droids. Sorry, no, all
Yes.
this, mixing those two up. All of what I just said is about the droids, not the clones. My apologies.
Yeah.
But yeah. So what's your take on the way the droids are portrayed? Not even getting into like individual ones like R2 and C-3PO, but what's your take on how the violence against the droids is portrayed in those movies?
And we sort of talked about this at nauseum in other episodes, but my stance has not changed. Um, I think it is not. I think it's reprehensible that because they're artificial life forms that we suddenly decide that they have no moral value.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and in particular, like to sort of piggyback on the commenting of the person who programmed the battle droids, I think that whoever coded them was particularly cruel because they probably thought it was funny to have them react in these ways and respond in these ways, and so they wanted, if their creations were going to be destroyed, they wanted to get some amusement out of it or something.
Yeah.
Just ick.
Yeah,
Like,
that's that.
really?
Oof, that I hadn't even thought about that. If someone like wanted to make them a little ridiculous, but that's certainly a possibility.
Why else? Like, unless they're developing those personalities on their own, in which case, still not okay, right?
Mm-hmm.
Actually, still not okay. Um, then it had to have been intentional on the part of the person who wrote their code.
Yeah,
Like,
and it's interesting because you started off talking about the Borg, and I feel like getting back to the original point of I want the writers to know there's an issue. Um, I don't think, and it's interesting because I do think Star Wars in general really wrestles with some great moral questions. I don't think anyone in the writers' room of the prequels was thinking that there was any moral weight whatsoever to the battle drones. I think they were
hmm
really trying to create them as having no moral weight whatsoever. Whereas on the other side, and this is something I'm aware of because friend of the podcast Matt Carroll has his Star Trek Universe podcast, and they recently did a whole bunch of episodes on um, episodes of Star Trek that are really relevant to the new Picard TV show and movies, and they talked about the movie First Contact. And one of the things that happens in First Contact that I think is really interesting is there's an instance where a Federation soldier, a Federation officer, is turned into a Borg drone, and moments later, Picard just blows him away without any
hmm
attempt to rescue him or to maybe change him back or anything like that. And we have seen in the TV show, it is canon in the character of Hugh, that a person can be disconnected from the collective and can regain their humanity or their individualism. And in that show, I think the writers know exactly what they're doing because they have the
Yep.
character of Lily specifically
Yep.
like call out Picard for you didn't even rescue him. You just treated him like a machine, not like there was a person inside or there was a being with any moral worth inside. And it's to me it's one of those areas where like 1,000 Borg drones are coming at you, 1,000 battle droids are coming at you. I think violence is pretty morally justified, but I do think that on that rabid dog versus Nazi scale, droids to me are much closer to the rabid dogs. Where, like you say, like I are the ones in Mass Effect you're talking about. It sounds like you probably have to shoot them, but
Yep.
it's not something to feel morally great about.
Correct. Yeah. It's again, like, it's kill or be killed. So I guess I got to do it. But yeah, it's not great.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it's like situations in some of these games where like some of your allies get turned and you end up having to fight them, right? It's
Yeah.
to me the programming thing and the mind control thing really they feel like they go hand in hand to me, where it's really the same question, that if you accept that these are individuals with agency absent what you're doing to them, then whether it's done via like a keyboard or some kind of digital connection, or whether it's done via magic space powers like Bester had, or um, magic whatever powers like Kilgrave has, like at the end of the day, there's another day dawning. But at the end of the day, you,
Don't
you
get Les
get
Mis stuck in my head.
anyway, it's the same, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's the same.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. So morally and ethically, leaving food to get cold is a pretty big moral sin. So I think we're going to kind of wrap up here. But are there any? We've just scratched the surface of what I think is a really interesting topic. Are there any kind of last points that you wanted to slip in before we get out of here?
Well, I was wondering if I was going to have time to work in that Mass Effect point, and I did, so I was very happy about that.
Mm.
I just want to one more time, especially since has Picard started yet? I don't even know.
It has, yeah. We have two episodes
Okay.
are out.
Yeah, I don't have CBS All Access, so I maybe someday might possibly watch it. I'm interested, but I want to sort of put over Star Trek, specifically Star Trek Next Gen, as an example of these are the kinds of stories I want when we're dealing with these situations, and I feel like I don't get that now.
Yeah.
And part of that probably is we are in the superhero era of media making, right? And so all of our heroic stories or our fictional stories, science fiction especially, we're dealing more with the, uh, more with, I guess, simpler and more action oriented stuff. And I miss stories that uh, teach us valuable ideas about what it means to interact with other individuals who have differing perspectives and points of view, and
Yeah.
how we unify with them rather than divide.
I would agree with that. Like, I feel like certainly movies, there's just far little ethical complexity, and that's a huge broad generalization. Obviously, we've done a lot of episodes on movies that are the exceptions to that. I do feel like there's some great stuff happening on television in terms of ethics of superhero stuff, and but I think you're right. The specific kind of questions that Star Trek did, especially about like, because I feel like this is something you and I, and also me and Paul, have talked about at length, is the idea of how easy it is to not assign moral value to something because it is so different than you and because it scares you, especially. And I think Star Trek especially was so good at saying, let's present you with something completely new and completely different and completely terrifying, but that actually is just as much has just as much moral weight, you know? To throw another great sci-fi one at, I know this is done more humorously. I know you're in a watch for the first time of Doctor Who, and you aren't through some of the most recent ones. Have you gotten to the characters called the Ood?
No, I don't think so.
Okay, then I won't say anything about that. But I do think, yeah, just in general, like, I think some things also do pretty good with it, but I think Star Trek was the absolute pinnacle of that kind of moral questioning. And in some
never
ways,
mind, I have.
Okay,
I love these guys.
Yeah, and I think that's also a great example because the Ood are presented as like monsters out of a Lovecraftian nightmare. You look at them and you think this is like straight out of Central Casting, bad science fiction bad guys, but they're great. You know, the Doctor at one point says, "No, an Ood. Everyone loves an Ood. Like they're friendly and helpful, but they look like monsters." And I just think that's such an interesting ethical way of questioning playing with these kind of things.
Yeah, I remember in the episode they were first shown on was like some kind of hell evil thing, right?
Yeah.
And it's yeah, they're great because of that subversion of that trope that they look evil but are actually kind of groovy.
Yeah, I think that's true. So let's kind of wrap up now. To everybody who's been listening, you've heard us toss a lot of ideas around. We got into some pretty touchy topics. What do you guys think? What are other great examples you think of some of the causes of some of the different classifications we brought up, and where do you think they fall? What do you think we were right about? What do you think we got wrong? What parts of the discussion you want to keep up and run with? There's a lot of great ways to find us. You can find us on Facebook, on Twitter, or on email, all at superheroethics. Or superheroethics@gmail.com. And you also can find both Paul and you can find Paul on Twitter, but more importantly, you can find both Jacob and myself on Twitter. And all that information is in the show notes. I'm happy to say also that after a lot of discussion, this podcast is now officially a part of a podcast network called the Stranded Panda Network. And it has now its own website, Stranded Panda. And that's where we can find a lot of the other podcasts that we're often talking about that are done by some by myself and some by other friends of ours. Matt Carroll, the person who I've talked about, has started it. And so it includes the MCU podcast, DC On Screen, my own Orville and Star Wars Universe podcasts, podcasts about the Watchmen, a new podcast they're doing called on binging, basically, where they're gonna they're starting out by getting ready for the newest X-Men movie by watching all the old X-Men movies. So it's kind of an awesome idea of like getting ready for a new thing by binging all the old stuff. So there's all sorts of great podcasts there, all of which are worth supporting and checking out, because if you like this kind of, delving into, science fiction, fantasy, geek media and really going deep on it, all those podcasts do that from different perspectives. So please check out all those other podcasts. And one last thing that I know Jacob and I want to talk about that we're definitely going to do a full episode on this later, but we're recording tonight the night of the Iowa caucus, when the voting for the upcoming elections of this year are first getting started. And I just wanted to make the point that heroes vote. It is, we talk a lot about the things that these shows teach us about how we can make our world better and how we can make better decisions and how we can not just watch these things, but act in our own lives. And you all who are listening, we may all sit at very different points in the political spectrum. I'm not going to tell you in any way who to vote for, but I want to just make the statement, Captain America says it, Superman says it, the most basic way that we can change the world is to vote. And so I hope that when the primary comes to your area, if you're an American listener, and when the general election comes, that you will vote and do your part as a superhero in the voting booth. If you live in other countries, I hope you live in a place where democracy is possible and you can vote. And if not, I hope that we can do all we can or you all can do your can, or everyone can do all they can to help make voting a possibility. So, Jacob, I think this is something you and I both agree on, that to me, the best way in our world that you can be a superhero right now is to cast a vote.
Absolutely. As I've said multiple times, but I will say it again, our participatory democratic republic does not work if you don't participate, if we don't get more people who are eligible to participate, who do participate and have your voice be heard. I know it doesn't feel heroic. I know that it feels just like you can be standing in line sometimes it can be difficult, tedious, you have to block out time. It's a little bit of time, a couple of days a year at most, and it is very, very worth it. The more of us that do it, the more we get a government that reflects our ideals and what we value as a people.
Exactly. So I'm going to sign off now and go watch a couple 100,000 superheroes in the state of Iowa. To all of you, thank you for listening. Thank you for being a part of this great community. Please keep listening. Please keep sharing this with your friends. Please giving us reviews on iTunes and all those places so we can help get the word out. Thank you very much. Have a great day.